Welcome back. Today, we're diving into an incredibly fascinating psychological and spiritual text. Honestly, the way this source connects classical psychology with deep spiritual philosophy is literally going to change how you look at your own emotions and your everyday reactions. Let's get right into the explainer.
I want to start off with a really direct question, one that sits right at the heart of our source material. What do you do with your pain? Seriously, take a second and think about it. We all have inner tension, right? We all have aggressive impulses, and, well, inevitable human suffering is just a part of daily life. When life throws a wrench in your plans or someone really hurts you, where does all that pulsing, anxious energy actually go? Hold on to that thought, because it's going to be the guiding thread for our entire journey today.
Section 1. What is sublimation? Freud's discovery.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really get what the author is arguing, we first need to establish the psychological baseline drawn by Sigmund Freud. The text points out right away that Freud made a brilliant and very real discovery about human energy, which is the concept of sublimation. So, sublimation is basically this psychological process where a raw, instinctual drive, like anger or intense desire, leaves behind the need for immediate satisfaction. Instead of just blowing up, that energy gets redirected into something socially acceptable. It's like taking the urge to punch a wall and channeling it into building a successful startup, or pouring all that tension into studying or creating art. It's a huge concept in psychology because it shows just how capable we are of steering our inner forces.
Section 2. Freud's limit. Refining the ego.
But here's where the author drops a major antithesis. They argue that Freud's discovery, as brilliant as it is, has a massive blind spot. It doesn't actually tell the whole story. In fact, a lot of the time, sublimation just changes the form of the discharge. Check out the contrast we're looking at here. A crude reaction to an impulse is pretty obvious, attacking with physical force, dominating someone by brute strength. Classical sublimation takes that primitive energy and turns it into a quote-unquote refined reaction. The person puts down the club, but they pick up a sword, you know? They attack with sharp words, they dominate using their intelligence, and they're constantly seeking applause or superiority. The energy looks a lot more polite and sociable on the outside, but underneath, the vanity, the envy, that intense need for control, the ego is still completely pulling the strings. It's still in charge of the whole shebang.
And that brings us to this absolutely crucial, punchy phrase straight from our source material. Sublimating is not sanctifying. Wow, it's a bold statement, but it cuts right to the chase. The author's point is that you can be incredibly productive, build a massive legacy, and be hailed as a genius, but deep down, you might still be a total slave to self-love. Sure, your aggression turned into a great career, but the core motivation, it's still entirely about you.
Section 3. The spiritual view of pain. Looking upward.
So, how do we actually break out of this ego trap? Well, the source presents a spiritual, specifically Christian perspective that shifts our gaze completely. Instead of looking down into the basement of our minds to just manage these primitive impulses, we're invited to look up through what they call the mortification of self-love. The author argues that true human elevation goes way beyond clinical psychology. It happens when you take that deep pain, that totally unfair humiliation, or that burning need to win an argument, and you consciously offer it up to God for a greater good. According to the text, this isn't just shuffling nervous energy around your brain, it literally changes the nature of the pain itself. The pain stops acting as fuel for your ego and transforms into something entirely new.
Section 4. A practical scenario. Dealing with difficult people.
Now, to keep this from sounding like just lofty theological theory, the source gives us a super relatable everyday scenario, dealing with someone who is just explosive, aggressive, or immature. We've all been there, right? Let's walk through the 4 distinct choices the text says we have for handling the suffering this causes. The first, base level, is discharge. This is when you just pay them back. You argue, you complain, you lash out. The second rung is repress. You swallow the pain, bottle it up, and eventually it makes you bitter and sick inside. The third option is Freud's route, sublimate. You take all that angry energy and go work out like a maniac or deep clean your house. It's useful, sure, but the fourth step, the very top of the ladder, is elevate. You acknowledge that the pain is real, but you choose to transform it into a sacrifice. You consciously decide not to let your reaction be defined by your own self-interest.
The source highlights this final step with a really intimate internal prayer. Lord, this hurts. I don't want this pain to govern me. I offer it to you for a greater good. Let's break down the mechanics of what's happening here because it's fascinating. The person is fully validating their suffering. They aren't pretending the wound isn't there, and they aren't ignoring the sting. But in that exact moment of offering, they hit the brakes. They stop the wounded ego from dictating the rules of the game. The pain gets yanked right out of that toxic cycle of vengeance and resentment and becomes material for inner growth. It's basically a complete short circuit of our natural defensive human reaction.
Section 5. A shift in center, from self to love.
So what does this all mean? What is the true fundamental difference happening here? Let's compare these two visions side by side. On one side, we have Freud's classical sublimation. The therapeutic focus is all about your inner drives, and the goal is to generate useful activity. But look at the center of gravity. It's still the self. It's about your image, your productivity, your win. On the flip side, we have Christian mortification. The focus shifts entirely to the wounded ego itself. The objective isn't just productivity, it's sacrifice and charity. The biggest game changer is that the soul stops orbiting around itself and places God or love right at the center. The person drops that childish demand that the whole universe has to revolve around their feelings, and they step outside of themselves entirely.
If there is one major takeaway you get from our explainer today, it should absolutely be this. True sublimation, what the source calls the highest elevation of pain, changes the center of the soul, not just the destination of the energy. It forces your pain to actively serve charity, instead of just stacking bricks in a wall of resentment. In this framework, self-love accepts sacrifice for the sake of a greater love. It's making that conscious, everyday choice to look up toward truth, rather than reacting from a bruised ego, and literally transforming your wounded self into a continuous offering. It takes suffering, the very thing that usually destroys us, and turns it into the exact mechanism that elevates us.
The text is incredibly clear. Human suffering is a guarantee. Nobody gets a free pass. Now, Freud did us a huge favor by showing we don't have to be mindless victims of our base impulses. But the spiritual vision we've unpacked today argues we can go so much further. We can transform the very nature of our pain into offered love. So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to wrap up today's explainer. When life inevitably trips you up and you feel that familiar sting of a bruised ego, will your wounds serve your ego or will they serve love? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.